late. Go ahead.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I am so glad you took time out of your schedule to meet with us. I am Brea Worthington. I am a board member of MORE, which is formerly PRI. One of our focuses is on community development, community advocacy, focusing on diversity, inclusion, and community engagement. I have some phenomenal panelists here today to help us with the outline for housing and discrimination. With that being said, I'm just gonna unmute everyone's mic and let you introduce yourselves first. We can start with Donna.
Yes, my name is Donna Polk. I'm the CEO of Nebraska Urban Indian Health Coalition. Our mission is to elevate the health status of urban Indians and underserved populations. And I'm a former PRI member, and hopefully I'll be accepted into the MORE group.
Bear.
Yeah, my name is Brea Alexander. I'm an organizer with ProBlac, and ProBlac, we're a social justice organization that fights against the atrocities that we feel as though plague our communities, not only locally, but also nationally. We've been isolated we've been fixated and engrossed on the premise of direct action solely. And we recognize that direct action is a very pivotal thing in the movement, but also we're focusing more towards a direct action, but then also a more community outreach. So we're not just a direct action group, but we are a community organization.
Ms. Crawford. You're muted. Oh.
Okay, can you hear me now okay?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Terri Crawford. Thank you so much. I am really glad to be able to participate as part of this discussion today. I am adjunct professor in the Department of Black Studies. I am also policy director for the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha and president of my sorority. So I will bring all of those into our discussion today, and I appreciate being here. Thank you so much.
Awesome, thank you. Danni?
Hi, I'm Danni Smith. I am a researcher at Together, which is an organization. We operate one of the largest food pantries in Omaha, and we also work in homeless services and housing for folks who are experiencing homelessness. So I work in our advocacy and policy department there in conjunction with our registered lobbyist. And I feed her the information that she needs to make policy initiatives that can help benefit the people that we serve. So I'm also really excited to be here and appreciate you inviting me to be on your panel today.
Awesome. Mr. Pierce, last but not least.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Pierce Greenberg. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Creighton University and have done research on evictions in Omaha, thinking about racial disparities related to that. I've also been involved in some discussions about racial impact statements in the state legislature. And so, yeah, I've been involved in a few discussions about race, and I'm really happy to be here to share with you. Thanks.
Awesome. I thank everybody for the awesome introductions. Let's kind of change the tempo slightly here. I'm going to read an excerpt from urban.org, just about discrimination in housing. Urban first measured discrimination against racial and ethnic minorities in 1989, revealing high levels of discriminatory treatment towards Hispanics and African Americans in both rental and sales markets nationwide. Roughly a decade later, the 2000 housing discrimination study found statistically significant lower levels of discrimination against African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and Native American home seekers. Though the overall incidence of discrimination had declined, Urban's latest studies published in 2012 found that there are still overt instances of door slamming discrimination. lower overt instances of door slamming discrimination had encountered, but real estate agents and rental housing providers recommend and show fewer available homes and apartments to minorities that are equally qualified. So what that means is, while there is not blatant discrimination, there is definitely isolation on what is being offered to equally qualified individuals of color. Ms. Crawford, I think I'm gonna lead off with you because you're awesome. No, just joking. Everybody here is great. But could you please describe UNO's Black Studies Department and the classes you teach?
Sure, I'll be glad to. Let me give you a little history about the department first. The Department of Black Studies at the University of Nebraska at Omaha is one of the oldest in the country. So it started around the 1960s, 1970s when there were protests across the country on college campuses so that we could have a Black Studies department. None existed at the time. So as a result of some of those protests, there were 54 Black students on our campus that went by the name of BLAC, B-L-A-C. That was the Black Liberators for Action on campus. As a result of their protests and their sit-ins at the president's office at that time, then the department is what was the result of that. Right now, the department is led by Dr. Cynthia Robinson, who is our chair of Black Studies. And if you go to our website, you will see our mantra on the site that says this: the Department of Black Studies will continue to fight the persistent racism, injustice, and violence facing Black Americans, and we will continue to say the names of those who have had their lives unjustly taken. So we take a stance in our department on all injustices, not just in Omaha, Nebraska, but across the country. We are a multidisciplinary team, and I'll talk some more about that as we get into some of our other questions. The course that I teach is called Law in the Black Community, is what I call my landmark course. The Law in the Black Community course allows us to do a critique of the American system of justice. So what we do is do an in-depth examination of the law and how it has been racialized since its inception in the United States. We start with the Constitution of the United States and the 3/5 clause and some of those other very racist clauses that were in our governing documents for the United States. And we start from a historical perspective and bring it all the way forward to a contemporary perspective. We draw from current headlines. We talked about Trayvon Martin, everything that's going on in the news. We do a historical comparison and then also contemporary comparison.
Awesome. Can you give us some examples of some of the research and the course material used with the current students, please?
Absolutely. So for purposes of this discussion, what I focus my research on, I guess, is housing discrimination, collateral consequences for those that have felony convictions. So the research we use to have those discussions comes from the U.S. Department of Justice, Sentencing Project, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, Brennan Center for Justice, and then some of the research materials that we have available on campus in our own library and in some of our own research departments. So what I did is look at what that looks like for those that are returning home from imprisonment. That could be exonerees or those that have served a full sentence. We talked about and we looked at what I like to call the Magnificent Seven. The Magnificent Seven are those 7 categories under the HUD guidelines that are protected classes. And if you look at those 7, and I'll just go through them real quickly: race, color, national origin, religion, sex, family status, and disability. What is not included is felony convictions. And we can have a conversation as to whether or not it should be included. And my position as a content expert on this would be absolutely, it should be included, because there's this badge that's stamped on those either exonerees or those that have served their sentences that still cannot have access to housing. Now, there's lots of research that shows that those that are returning home have 3 major concerns when they are returning. One is housing, one is employment, and then of course reunification with their families. Housing being at the top of that list. One of the things that has happened in federal law and state law alike is landlords can constitutionally exclude those that have a felony on their record. And depending on what their crime was that they have been convicted of, it can be a lifetime ban.
Thank you, Terri. Can you give me some examples of ways to avoid these types of discriminatory practices besides being an offender?
Sure, absolutely. So some of the things that we talked about is there are ways to handle some of these on a local basis. One thing that comes to mind more than maybe many others is to ban the box. We have been successful in banning the box when it comes to employment applications. We should also be able to do it, and it has been done in other jurisdictions, is to ban the box on rental applications, so that one of the first questions that is asked of some of those that are seeking housing does not have to be, have you been convicted of a felony? And if so, what is that felony? So ban the box will be one way to do it. Other ways to do it on a local level would be through city council, to administrative agencies, and also through our legislative body to help those that are returning home have more of an opportunity to have sustainable housing so that they don't fall back into some other patterns and end up as part of the group of recidivism.
Thanks, Terri. Give me, I would like to come back. I have a couple questions on that, but I want to get to our other panelists since we have such a limited amount of time. Donna, the CEO of the Urban Indian Health Coalition, would you like to give us a brief description of your organization and what you guys do?
Absolutely. We are primarily a federal contractor with the Indian Health Service. We receive the majority of our funding, which is substantial for a small nonprofit, from the federal government to provide services and to increase access to services for urban Indians. And before I give any other information, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that we are on Indian land, period. And people rarely, if ever, acknowledge that. And I think it's just out of ignorance. They don't realize that Nebraska was named by the Omaha tribe, which is only about 79 miles north of this city. And the majority of people that I encounter have never even been there. And so I want to say that we should take a moment to consider, particularly when we're talking about land and property, that this was not the land of the people who dominate politically, religiously, educationally, this land at this point. So I do just want to acknowledge that. But we've been in existence in Omaha, Lincoln, and Sioux City, Iowa since 1986. And that was because when the government decided to try to relocate Native people from east to west, they figured out that there were very few services available for Native people. So they funded organizations to make sure that Native people could be at least referred to services. And in Omaha, that is still very challenging because Omaha itself is very segregated. There's North Omaha, which is code word for African Americans, South Omaha, which is code for Hispanics or Latinos or whatever politically correct way there is to acknowledge them. So we provide a variety of services: residential treatment, outpatient behavioral health, Tired Moccasins, which is a program for senior citizens, the Soaring Over Meth and Suicide program, which is, that name or acronym speaks for itself, SOMS. But what I'd like to just mention very briefly is that when we identified housing as a problem in terms of being able to provide accessible, low income or affordable housing, I felt the need to try to do something about it. It's very easy to identify problems and talk a lot about them, but it's phenomenal when you're in a position to be able to do something. So we have just completed our first new construction, which is at 23rd and N Street in South Omaha. We have 44 units of affordable housing. It's just very, in my opinion, beautiful. I was just over there yesterday, and one of the tenants invited me and one of my board members into her apartment. She moved there from the Stevens Center, and her place was just beautiful. I mean, she's the person I would hire to decorate my home. And I was just joyful because she was so happy to be in a secure building, affordable rent. Um, uh,
Is there any, Ms. Polk, is there any restrictions to the guidelines on the affordable housing, new constructions?
Yes, there are restrictions. And I know Terri Crawford talked about the HUD guidelines. And so when we met with the rental agent, and it's NP Dodge, it was that company was selected by the developer that we worked with. I wanted to know what restrictions there were. I'm very aware of racism and considerations that really screen people out. And so the first thing he mentioned had to do with convictions. And I said, okay, what are those? Well, you can't have had a felony in the last 10 years. And I go, okay, third or fourth offense DWI can be a felony. So you mean I can't have a tenant that has had a drinking problem? And he kind of stuttered about that. And I said, no, I'm not buying that. What we will not have as tenants in my property are convicted sex offenders and people who have been convicted of manufacturing methamphetamines. Those are two very dangerous lifestyles that I believe would jeopardize the safety of our tenants. And that is just firm, and I'm not willing to give on that. Other
Okay.
than that, as far as ban the box is concerned, I've been banning the box since the 80s because I volunteered in prisons and I told people you need to tell people what your background is. Nowadays, you can ban the box if you want because everyone does background checks. So you can say, I didn't do anything, but if it shows up on your record, that's where the problem is.
So Dr. Polk, when we say that, there's two things that I always wonder when you hear that there's new construction developed by Urban Indian Health Coalition. I want to make sure that our audience understands that there is no requirement to be Native American or
Absolutely, that's correct. In our project, there are tribes and other programs around the country that do require that you be a Native American. And I did not want to do that for this very simple reason. We have many Native people in Omaha who meet the financial guidelines, but they're interracially married, they have biracial or bi-ethnic children, or, I just don't want to do that. I was not raised in a segregated environment. So I did not want to do that. And if you come to our facility, you will see people of all ethnicities that live in Eagle Heights. That's the name of our apartment.
Okay, one last question for you, and then I'm going to move to another panelist. With NP Dodge being your real estate handler, how are you able to filter through so that they're not disqualifying candidates to move into your facility?
Well, one of the first things that after the HUD felony guideline discussion, I had a problem with them having credit checks. And I think they said it was $40. And I said, no, if you have a credit check, I'll pay the $40. But the only thing that I'm aware of that really disqualifies a person are active eviction notices. And because we're relatively new in this arena, we have monthly meetings with the agent who is on the premises, okay? Because I want to know the demographics of the people who live there. And later on, hopefully, I'll have a chance to talk a little bit about the service building that we're going to renovate right across the street. But that's the deal. I want to know who lives there, if there are obstacles to people getting into the building. Of course, there was a long waiting list. We had a waiting list, NP Dodge had a waiting list, but I know the demographics of the people that live in that building.
Awesome, thank you. Bear, could you give us a little example or description of your organization, please?
Yeah, I kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, so my apologies. But yeah, we are an organization, a social justice organization, and we speak out on the atrocities that we feel as though plague our communities nationally and locally. We were fixated and engrossed when we were founded on specifying the direct action approach rather than exhausting other resources, because we felt that the direct action was not happening in Omaha, and there was a lack of protest, and there was a lack of holding our political leaders accountable. So we were really fixated at the beginning on being out in the streets and instilling a culture of resistance in the younger generation on holding our political leaders accountable and holding our system accountable. Now, 6 months later, we recognize that there are many different factions to the movement and how to dismantle any type of system or change any type of system that you want to change, and we haven't been focusing on that. So we are focusing more on behind the scene works, community outreaches, more community advocacy that's not just direct action. So we're going from a direct action group to more of a community organization, but still focusing on direct action because we still look at that as a very prominent tactic in the movement.
Awesome. So when you say you're doing direct action in the movement, does that mean like policy action, or is that more so like what kind of advocacy does that mean when you say action in the movement?
When I mean direct action, I'm more so speaking upon protesting in the streets, doing sit-ins, doing boycotts, things along those lines that aren't so much behind the scenes, that are more upfront, that are more pushing the boundaries in a sense, that are more provocative, which I do feel like protests are supposed to be provocative. They are supposed to emit some sort of feeling in whatever system that you're protesting. So we were focused on more sit-ins. We did mayor sit-ins, we did boycotts, we did protests, we were marching in the streets, we wanted to mobilize. That was our direct action, is being in the streets and mobilizing. Now we recognize that direct action, physical direct action, is not the only action that you can exhaust in the movement. So we can do more to focus on, like I said, like we're talking about housing discrimination or food insecurities or clothing insecurities, education programs, and using our platform that we have built and are continually building to the community's benefit.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple questions for you, but I'll come back to you. Danny, if you could give us a little bit of the research perspective on things.
Sure. As a researcher at Together, some of the things that we have looked into have been in the areas of housing. We've been looking at housing quality as well as access to quality. And again, these are typically things that we're interested in terms of our policy initiatives. Currently, since the pandemic, we've been largely focused on eviction trends and how these are also intersecting with those other issues of housing quality, compliance with city ordinances, things of that nature. So during the CARES moratorium that ran during the summer, for instance, we were working with legal aid, trying to identify some of those illegal evictions. So in terms of the data, some of the most troubling trends I would say that we're seeing right now, for example, during the pandemic, more than 40% of all of the eviction filings in Omaha for residential evictions were in 5 zip codes in North Omaha. And keep in mind that there are about 30 zip codes total in Omaha. So for five of those to contain 40% of evictions is a huge disparity. So we're talking about zip codes 68104, 68110, 68111, 68112, and 68134. All of those were in the top 10 for Douglas County, except for 68112. And if I can share my screen. Are we allowed to do screen sharing?
This is Karen, and let me see if I have to give you, I'm going to give you permission. Here
Okay.
you go. And there you should get that. Now you can go.
Okay. Thank you. Can folks see that okay?
The chat box is quiet, so I'm gonna assume yes.
All right. So this here is, as I was just saying about the eviction filings in Omaha, these are those 5 zip codes that I was mentioning in North Omaha, and then this is all of the other zip codes for Omaha. And again, these are the top eviction zip codes in the Omaha area during the pandemic. The dark purple indicates the ones that are in North Omaha, lavender are out of that area, and then the sort of medium purple is 68131, which is adjacent. So again, you can see there really is a disparity in terms of those numbers that we see. Here is as well, just in July, this is the heat map of where these eviction filings were taking place.
I know one of the things that has happened with the trying to redevelop North Omaha is that they have increased the amount of development that they've done as far as housing. Do you think that that will affect some of these numbers, or will it make it easier for those target zip codes to be able to find housing or suitable housing?
Yeah, I absolutely would say that. One of the things that we are seeing actually has been an increase in both the eviction cases as well as the housing code violations. That generally is an indicator of lower quality housing, and we're seeing an increase in those numbers for the 68134 zip code, which for anyone who's not aware, that's the area north of Blondo, about between 72nd and 108th Street. So what's happening is that folks are being priced out of Northeast Omaha and moving into those areas, and a lot of the times the quality there, as well as being allowed to deteriorate, and folks are having to move further west just to find housing they can afford. And it is getting a lot harder for people to afford housing even without the pandemic. Access to programs like Section 8, for example, is one of the barriers that we've found in terms of increasing access to affordable housing. So Section 8 is one of the housing assistance programs that's run through HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's cited a lot of the times as one of these solutions for making sure that everyone can access housing, but a lot of people don't realize that unlike programs like SNAP, which is some people still refer to as food stamps, the funds for Section 8 are not guaranteed for everyone who needs them. It's actually on a lottery system. So if a family that is struggling to afford their housing is lucky enough to be selected, they also only have 60 days to identify and secure this housing. And that gets us into this issue here. In January of this year, before the pandemic, we did a sample of over 200 online listings for housing that was at HUD's fair market guidelines. And we found that only about 20% of properties in Omaha accept Section 8. So that, for example, is one of the solutions that we currently have, and it's just not working for a lot of folks. So that's just an example of the data that we see kind of on the ground, and how that's making it a lot harder for people to afford housing. And then we see things like greater rates of eviction, lower quality housing that people are having to move into just to be able to have some form of housing. We see those eviction numbers go up, and the housing code cases go up as well.
Danny,
This is Donna, and I'd like to just add something to your excellent report. I read it, and of course I was horrified because it's almost as if people don't understand what's happening in North Omaha, and it's a tragedy. But it's a ball that's rolling down the hill, and it can't be stopped. But I live at 104th and Maple, and I'm surrounded by older apartment compounds, or however you want to call them, apartment complexes, I guess. And so you can see what's happening. Just I can sit in my garage and watch people walking up and down the street that in the 10 years I've lived here, they didn't live here before. And so The other thing I want to comment on that's related to what you're talking about is the fact we received CARES money. And part of that was to help people who were behind in their rent payments. I don't know what's going to happen January 1st when all of the rent comes due that people have not paid for the last 4 months. It is going to be a tragedy in this community. And it's just not in the zip codes that you mentioned, but of course, you know, you've got people that are making $10 an hour that are living in $1,200 a month apartments. How does that even work?
So thank you, Donna. Let's lead into Pierce because he has a little bit of knowledge on the evictions policies in Omaha. And then I think we can piggyback on some of the other things.
Mhm.
And just so you know, I am writing down the questions that are in the chat box, but I'm trying to get through all the panelists first. Go ahead, Pierce.
Oh, sure. So yeah, this is a good segue from what Danny has done, and we've been talking about doing some research together, but we published a report over the summer titled Understanding Evictions in Omaha, which we started before the pandemic, and looked at the last 8 years of evictions in Omaha. And, you know, a lot of people didn't have the information on this before, but we show things like how many evictions there were per year, and more importantly, similar to what Danny showed, where those evictions are happening. And I'll just talk a little bit generally about why that's so important. Evictions are really important because there's been a lot of research done about how these aren't just a consequence of poverty, that you don't have enough money to pay your rent and then you get evicted, but that they can be a cause of poverty, right? They can be something that causes someone to get into this cycle of instability and poverty. And so there's some statistic out there, I think I'm going to butcher it, I should probably memorize it, but something like 40% or 50% of Americans can't even afford a $500 unexpected expense, right? And when that's the case, you might not be in poverty, but if something unexpected happens, whether it be a medical issue or a childcare issue or something else, and that leads to your being evicted, then that can really have devastating impacts on individuals. The other thing we emphasize in the report is that evictions have impacts on communities too. It's not just the person being evicted, but the fact that evictions are concentrated in certain areas leads to less social stability and people having those connections with their neighbors and things like that. So that's what we focus on in the report. And the main topic of the report is race, because you can't look at the maps that we put together and conclude that it's anything but race that is underlying where evictions are happening. And so we talk about some of the institutional racism dating all the way back to redlining that influences the geographic distribution of where evictions are happening. And so, yeah, and then the last thing is just, we also try to show that there's overlaps statistically between where evictions are happening and where health problems are happening. Educational outcomes are lower in places with higher evictions, and major disparities between some schools in Omaha have a school attendance area with 10 evictions, and some are in areas with 1,700 evictions over the past 8 years. It's really a striking disparity. So we're just trying to raise awareness about that.
Okay.
Bree, can I just comment real quickly on some of the things that Danny and also Pierce has said, because I think part of the conversation that has always not necessarily been researched on a larger scale as to juxtapose what this looks like when we have returning citizens coming into these same zip codes in these communities. A lot of those individuals don't have access to some of the subsidized programming like Section 8 because of what their criminal convictions are and other types of public assistance. So a lot of times they may end up homeless. A lot of times they may end up returning to criminal activity, and we have to juxtapose that over all these other conversations about what do we do with these citizens that are returning home, because they are coming home to our communities, just like other communities across the United States.
Yes, Ms. Crawford, you're right. One of the things that I did want to touch on, because I think when you're talking about the eviction process, there's a lot of things that a lot of landlords take advantage of because people in those target zip code areas don't know their rights and they don't know the law. I don't know who here may want to touch on this, but you know, what rights do tenants have? Like you said, some of the housing, houses that are available to them are substandard. How do they go about addressing those issues without being evicted?
Brea, if I could address that, when I convinced my board that we needed to get into housing, I researched what programs are available to help tenants. I've been a landlord in the past, and it was a horrible experience. But I figured maybe on a different scale, it could be different if there were supportive services to help people who are tenants and don't know their rights. So what we did, we developed a program called Ready to Rent, and it's unique in Nebraska and maybe even in the region. And we offer a 12-hour course to people who want to be or are in a position to be renters. And they can go to the course, it's free, and they learn tenants' rights, basically. I wrote the first Landlord Tenants Act in Nebraska and gave it to my state senator to introduce in the legislature because I have been treated so poorly, both based on race and gender and you name it in Lincoln, Nebraska. And so I believe that we have people who, if they just know what to do, and we're in Eagle Heights. I met yesterday with some young tenants and they asked if we could have a advisory committee. Well, yes, of course. We're going to have a bulletin board so that people are kept up to date on things locally that they might benefit from. I sit on so many different committees to find out. I didn't know that OPS has social workers who can help people with food, transportation, rental assistance, utility assistance. I didn't know that. It's an excellent idea. But we have to know what's going on and be able to give that information to people who can use it. One of the things I've tried to do also, since we have transitional housing, I've tried to tell people, if you want to be a criminal, you need to understand the law. You need to understand how it's going to impact not only you, but your family, the community. These things don't happen in isolation. And these are the penalties you may face, because we have people who come out of prison and they live in our housing, not the new apartments so far because the waiting list was so long, but in Eagle Heights transitional housing on Howard Street. Okay, they need to know what the expectation is of them in being a part of our community. And when I say our community, I'm talking about Nebraska Urban Indian Health.
Well, with that being said, and just to piggyback on Danny and Pierce, one of the things that I've noticed in the trend, like you said, certain areas there are 1,700 evictions versus maybe 7 in a different target zip code. Do you believe that the communities understand the importance of going to those eviction courts? Because sometimes those evictions may not occur if they just attended the hearing.
Brea, let me speak to that, because I have seen on many occasions where individuals maybe don't understand the importance of when you receive a notice to show up in court and they don't show up in court, that you may have a judgment entered against you simply because you didn't show up. You may have had an opportunity to have your voice heard and your side of the story heard by an independent tribunal or a judge, but if individuals don't show up for those hearings, then you will have a judgment against you and you will be forced to leave the premises. So I don't believe that educational piece is used enough in some of these areas. And Donna, I think you're absolutely right. Things like a tenants' rights association, fair housing also has information that can be used on a regular basis. The Landlord-Tenant Act, for those that are astute enough to go to the act and write their own documents. There's lots of help available, but you have to seek it out. And then you also have to be able to interpret it for yourselves. But it's vitally important to show up at those hearings.
And fellow panelists, we have to understand too, sometimes people can't get off work to go to a hearing, because the hearings, we don't have night court in Omaha. I think they started having it in Lincoln. But if you're gonna lose your job because you need to go to court, you know what I'm saying? So that's a part of the whole disparate treatment and situation, because the landlord can have a lawyer show up on their behalf or one of their rental agents.
And do.
Yes.
One of the, go ahead, Pierce.
I was going to say, I'm glad you brought that up. So one thing we looked at in the report that with using the information we got from the state court system is legal representation, and less than 1% of people in Omaha over this 8-year period had legal representation in eviction court. And that's one thing we talk about at the end, that like, well, when you're charged with a crime, at least you get a public defender, right? And we could talk about the effectiveness of that and other problems maybe with institutional racism and that, but in eviction, it's something that can have huge consequences. But there is very little legal representation. And I want to follow that up by saying Legal Aid of Nebraska right now is sort of like a stopgap. The biggest organization, I think, doing that sort of legal work on the ground. And maybe Danni could talk more about that, because I know she's been involved in that process a little bit.
Before we go further than that, I think sometimes tenants, especially that 1%, less than 1%, struggle with paying their rent if there's mold in their home and they're having to incur increased medical costs. Could someone explain the importance of documenting because we have slumlords, and I know we have the mayor's hotline now due to that incident that happened at Tommy Rose? I think that's what his name. But the importance of documenting when there are substandard living conditions. I know a lot of single mothers or families that live in poverty may be living with broken windows, so their utility bills are extremely high to stay warm, but they don't know that they can report that. And there is a lot of judges that were in their judgments that you can't charge them rent until you fix these things. How important is it for people to document when they notify their landlord of substandard living conditions?
Just let me say, Bree, I'm sorry. Just let me say, one of the reasons why we've been able to have lots of movement on the ground with social justice and other things that have happened, particularly what comes to mind is George Floyd, is because of documentation and the people that are available there with their phones documenting everything that goes on. One of the practices that I have in all genres where I participate is, if you don't document it, then it didn't happen. Documentation is so important to have your voice heard, and also document the type of substandard living that some of these landlords have some of their tenants living and breathing in. So I can't express enough how important it is to have that documentation, to have pictures, to film it, and anything else that you can do, have witnesses. It is very important to have that information.
Well, I'm gonna jump it one minute, Donna. I'll get to you. But I know that everyone keeps throwing out the CARES money, but we have to also remember that there are many of hardworking people that don't qualify for the CARES money. If you did not lose your job or you weren't laid off due to the COVID-19, you do not qualify for rental assistance or utility and gas assistance. So therefore, they're backed into the corner. They may need the funds. They may have somebody may need the money, but they don't qualify. And while it is a ton of money, but the restrictions and the guidelines for that funding is very hard for some people to be able to access or even understand the application to be able to do so. So I was just throwing that out to Eric because I seen him write that about the CARES assistance, but it only affects people that were laid off due to a CARES circumstance.
Well, it depends upon how you wrote your application to get the money, because trust and believe, we were able to provide funding to some individuals without a lot of that, just by virtue of the fact that groceries, everything in the supply chain went up. And so we had 3 generational family structures that happened because of COVID. And so you had to be creative in order to be able to circumvent some of the obstacles that were put in our path. But just like the landlords keep track of what they term as bad tenants, people keep track of bad landlords. We know who the bad landlords are. And it's not just the ones that put Bible scriptures up by all of their properties. Come on now. I mean, there are neighborhoods you go, the drug dealers are standing outside of people's doorways. We just have to become more involved in getting rid of these people that are mistreating people, having mold in the apartments. Come on, that'll kill you. Just like lead is back. The city spent over $300 million abating lead, and lead is back. So I'm just saying to the young man, Bear, I believe his name is, you know, we need people like him who are on the ground saying, we won't take this anymore, because people are afraid to be homeless. Go to the West Coast, go to Las Vegas and see what homelessness really looks like. You know, I just need to say this. I believe the Creator said that we were going to have one more chance, because the air was nasty, the water's nasty, the ground is nasty. And the Creator said, I'm going to put this plague on you so you'll feed the hungry, house the homeless, take care of the sick. And those are all the things we're doing. Like what would we be doing if we didn't have COVID? I promise you, we wouldn't even be having this discussion.
Bear, just to throw, because it seems like your mic has been a little quiet over there. So for your advocacy efforts, do you have like contact information if people wanted to get in contact with you about the discriminatory housing situations? Since you seem to be a community advocate on those things.
Right. We partner very closely with Omaha Tenants United. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. And we work closely with them. And we actually do have a couple members of Omaha Tenants United in ProBlac as well, where we are going to eviction courts, and letting people know who are actually going to eviction court and educating them on their rights and letting them know what they can and what they can't do and what their landlords and real estate agencies can and can't do, and not to be fooled and discouraged at all. But we also recognize that, like you guys brought up, not a lot of people go to eviction court, and not a lot of people even, or they're afraid to, or just for a multitude of reasons of why you wouldn't go to eviction court, because of jobs, or you are afraid of the outcome or something along those lines. So it's letting people know about the information and getting that information out. Like what Donna said about that 12-hour course, I think that's amazing. And what ProBlac we really want to start implementing is education classes, specifying for housing rights and rights to tenants. Like Malcolm X said, we need to start focusing on the landless instead of the landlords of our society.
Could we get some contact information in the chat box on how to get in contact with the Omaha Tenant Association or even any of your organizations, so that people here, because I think some people are having to leave, in order to be able to do some more advocating, because I know right now is a very difficult time for our community in general.
Right. For contact for Omaha Tenants United, you can follow them on any social media outlet. Omaha Tenants United OTU. Same with ProBlac as well. You can follow us on any social media outlet and contact us through that. Contact us through that, and same with Omaha Tenants United. Contact them as well. Omaha Tenants United, they're always at eviction court for every week. For the last couple of months, they've been at eviction court. I think it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, or Monday, Tuesday, Friday, something along those lines. And they're always there. They always have a couple people there who are representing the community, which is amazing. So if anybody is interested in that, hit up Omaha Tenants United. ProBlac, we collaborate with them. We are not at the eviction court. We are focusing more on the education aspect, but Omaha Tenants United, they specifically isolate themselves for the people of speaking in regards of tenants of Omaha. So Omaha Tenants United is amazing.
Awesome. Ms. Crawford and Mr. Pierce, I'm asking you two because you both are at the universities, and legal aid has came up a lot in the chat box. One of the things that when I've referred people to legal aid that we've run into a barrier at in our community is there's more requests or demand than there are people to help with legal aid. So for someone that can't get through the legal aid and the wait is too long, because if you get a 30-day notice and you have to show up to court and you can't get to a legal aid person, how would you want them to go about reaching out to someone to address the eviction process or the predatory discrimination in their neighborhood?
Two things that I would suggest is Fair Housing, which is located right on 24th and Lake Street, is one of the people that they should be in contact with. Teresa Hunter, I believe, is the director at Fair Housing. And there's also Midlands Bar Association, which is the Black bar right here in Omaha, Nebraska, should reach out and make those contacts. Other things that have happened in other cities, because we have our new legislative session that's coming up in January, they have advocated in other cities successfully to have an evictions court. It's a specialty court, just like a drug court would be, and we now have veterans court in Nebraska. There's no reason why we couldn't advocate for an evictions court, particularly based on the numbers that Danny and Pierce have presented here today. We all as panelists and those that are on as participants could advocate for an evictions court, particularly in the wake of COVID-19, to see if we can push that with our legislators to make sure that that happens in Nebraska.
Do you have a deadline? Because I think that is one of the things that we ask the panelists is to come with a solution on how we can assist the community in these issues. So the legislature, I'm a child welfare guru, not this one. So do you have a deadline for when we need to be kind of advocating for that?
Well, it can start right now, contacting your representatives for your legislative districts. They come back in session in January. So if you start contacting them right now, they will have the conversation. Someone is going to have to bring it to the floor, and it's going to have to go through the process. So that can start, that's something we can do today by reaching out to those legislators.
And you don't have an excellent idea. And because people have started announcing their candidacy for mayor and city council, and I don't know what other, I think those might be the only two things locally. When you have an opportunity to go to their forums, or if they're asking you for a donation to support their campaign, ask them where do they stand on this issue. And maybe somebody, I don't know, Pierce, Danny, if you have access to what other people have done in other communities, it's often helpful just to take their legislation and see if it fits what we're trying to do. And then we could say, here, this is our idea for what we want the city to do, or the county, or the state. That's the way we do that. And we're unified in what we're saying, what the message is. So Terri, that's an excellent idea.
I agree, and I think we also have to keep in mind while we're having these conversations, returning citizens have to be part of the conversation that we have with our legislatures and some of the stringent obstacles that are in their way when they return to our communities.
Hey, Danny, I think we kind of went to the statistics and then we kind of just jumped right in the eviction court. I think that's one of the near and dear due to the CARES. Do you have any input that you might want to put in on the statistics that I know right now they've tried to do this revitalization of the 75 North, the gentrification. Have you noticed any trends that have made this better, worse, the same? Because I know that when we looked at marginally oppressed populations, the educational piece is also affected. Have you noticed any changes in that?
Would you be referring to maybe like education for tenants or?
It actually, one of the studies that they put out, what was it, 2 years ago, showed that in the target zip code areas, the children in those public schools scored significantly lower on the standardized testing. And part of that federal funding that they received was based upon having to use some of those resources that they received for the gentrification to educate the children. So have you noticed any changes or any growth in that area?
So that's outside of my area of research. I'm wondering if perhaps Pierce might have, I've mostly been focused on evictions during the pandemic, so I would maybe see if Pierce has something to add on that.
Yeah, I'm not quite aware of that study. I think this is something a lot when sometimes funds are allocated for a purpose, and then we never hear back on the impact of it. But yeah, there are certainly. I mean, I think at least from what we're looking at, there's still big educational gaps and disparities in across Omaha and related to evictions as well. But yeah, I don't have any information about the specifics.
So
I think,
Donna, I was gonna say you three, Bear, Donna, or Terri, please.
Well, I can say that I just looked at national and local statistics regarding education of American Indian and Alaska Native kids, children, students. Because we have a monthly conversation with Dr. Logan from OPS. And of course, I'm very, very concerned because of the sporadic opportunities kids seem to have with regard to regular school attendance, whether it's virtual or in person. I'm very concerned. And nationally, Native American children are really having a pretty negative experience in all schools, whether it's on reservations or in urban centers. And we're trying to come up with a way to address this, something called Project Upstream. We want to look at social determinants of health, and of course housing and healthcare play a big role in that. And we're seeing with COVID that African Americans and Latinos are the mortality rate, and Native Americans, of course, but it's very challenging to get data, health data on American Indians. But because of underlying conditions, and many of these underlying conditions are directly related to where they live. I mean, my goodness, if you live in a neighborhood where there's gunfire, or you are afraid to send your kids to the corner grocery store because they might get hurt, or there might be a robbery in progress. These are real things. I'm not talking hypothetical. I'm not talking about Baltimore and Chicago. I'm talking about Omaha, Nebraska. And so those are things that we have to get a handle on. And then it's because it gets down to, do Black lives only matter if you're killed by a white person? I have to say that because I'm looking at data from across the country to see where the protests are and who's doing the protests and who doesn't get protested.
If I can jump in as well, someone earlier, I believe Robert, had asked what the reasonings are for some of these disparities that we're seeing in housing. And I think a lot of like what you just said, it really is sort of a snowball. So a lot of, when we're talking about code violations or evictions, we see a lot of the times it's expounding on other issues in the community. So things like racism or discrimination, poor access to housing, lack of an affordable housing supply, some of the barriers that people have in getting housing. So as it's been mentioned before, if you have a history of an eviction or a history of involvement with the justice system, maybe if you have a lower credit score, things like that, those are all barriers. And then that in turn forces people into lower quality housing. So that's something that really drives those disparities in that area. And we do actually see a connection, as was mentioned a few minutes ago as well, between the quality of the housing and what people are being evicted from. So one of the things that was most shocking to me is that during the pandemic, about 40% of the eviction addresses had a code violation in the last 3 years, which is a pretty big number. And it just goes to indicate that people are being evicted as well from lower quality housing. As it was brought up earlier, people being evicted from places that have code violations in them, we actually identified about 5% of all of these properties in Douglas County, there was an active code violation in that particular unit. So that meant 36 families were being facing an eviction from the property, and the city had already identified their housing as substandard. But a lot of the times people might not know, they don't know their rights, they don't, again, it's a matter of being able to show up to court. If you can even show up to court, if you have representation, if you have someone who can bring that up. And a lot of the times that in of itself is just a huge factor that deters people.
I agree. And Bree, just briefly, I wanted to go back to the educational piece, if I could. I teach a class called Brown v. Board of Education. It's one of the landmark classes in the Department of Black Studies. And Bear mentioned this direct attack, which of course was the legal strategy of Thurgood and his team. So I think we have to, when we have this conversation about the educational disparities and how it all intersects with evictions and economics and environmental, we really have to talk about what exists in the system. Prior to COVID-19, we had huge disparities in what has been coined a learning gap, but it actually has more to do with educational opportunities and access to resources where our schools are concerned within those same zip codes that you mentioned, Danny. So I think we have to have that conversation. Overall, you know, COVID has brought a lot of this stuff to the top of the heap, if you will, but all of this existed prior to COVID. And that's why for me, I really have to focus on the returning citizens, because their issues existed prior to COVID-19 and they're going to continue to exist after COVID. Fair housing has to be for all of our citizens, and the collateral effects is going to also affect all of our children in all of our schools and all of those zip codes.
I agree. I think I have one more. So I think Terri, since your mic is, well, you muted again. I wanted to go back to the box branding. I know that you and Donna kind of capitalized on people with convictions being excluded out of certain types of housing. The one thing that I wanted to clarify when you guys say advocating for them to eliminate the box brand, the banding of the box, are we talking about violent crimes, or are we just talking about methamphetamine in general? Because I think that's where we get to a sticky situation, especially probably when you take it to legislature, when you're saying banding the box on convicted criminals. What do you mean? Like, what is the time frame on that particular area?
Well, a couple of things. Time frame, for me, it's always immediate, because you can always have these conversations with your legislative representative.
No, I'm sorry. I mean, when I say time frame, like a convicted, someone that has been convicted of a crime in the past, should they have not been in trouble within the last year, or what would be your guidelines on that if we're doing, because you know, one of the things with legislature, you're going to have some type of time frame before they ban that.
So right now, what is used in both public and private housing is what's called the look back period. The look back period allows landlords to look back into your prior criminal activity as far as 10 years. And if it's a private landlord that does not receive funds for public housing, sometimes they'll go back further than that. Now, 10 years is a lot of time for rehabilitation to occur. Should that person continue to be punished for a crime that they committed 10 years ago and no longer have access to housing? My personal opinion is no, because that, again, will have collateral consequences for children, for families, and for others. And public housing will also do things like if family or a person, let's say, not an entire family, but if a person is involved in drug-related criminal activity is the language that they use. Or other criminal activity that would adversely affect the health, safety, or right to peaceful enjoyment. All of those are very vague type of language that's used for exclusion. So I think it would be helpful to have a definition of what all of this means. A lot of times we have generations of families living together, and we may have a teenager who may be involved in smoking marijuana that the mother doesn't know anything about. And if that teenager is seen smoking marijuana, then the whole family is subject to eviction based on this language. So we need to kind of clarify language and kind of not have such broad language, and maybe not have the entire family be affected by one family member who has been involved in what has been characterized as criminal activity.
And another thing, like Terri has mentioned, folks can actually be evicted as well if they are the victim of domestic violence. Mm-hmm. So that's something as well that we've seen even during the pandemic. I have seen a number of cases where it mentions that because that's considered criminal activity. So even if you are the victim, a lot of the times in the lease, it will say that you're responsible for the behavior even of your guests. So if you are living in a rental housing and you have a partner who is abusing you, you can actually be evicted for that as well. So that's
along with your children.
And I just want to say that, you know, I spent 26 years in the Department of Corrections as a volunteer from the 70s to the 90s. Okay. So I have an understanding, I believe, of some of the obstacles that people who are felons experience, both at the federal level and at the state level. And that's why I try to do whatever I can to educate people so that they understand consequences. Now, I met with the regional administrator of HUD so that I had an understanding of what the HUD guidelines were as it relates to occupancy of federally funded properties. And I came away with an understanding, and that's why I said we will not have two classes of felons in our property. And that's to protect the people who live there. And I just have a strong feeling that if someone can tell me how people who commit those crimes have been rehabilitated and are not at risk for committing other acts, then maybe I would look at it very differently. I believe the sex offenders and people who manufacture methamphetamines cannot live on our properties. Now, ban the box if you want, but as long as people can pay $50 to have a criminal background check, you're going to run into the same problems.
Well, here's two things. I understand your rationale for banning sex offenders and people that manufacture methamphetamines. But one of the statistics is with the methamphetamine use is a lot of those people that are manufacturing or their houses are used to manufacture, they're not really the manufacturer. They tend to have been a user at one point in time. So my question to you is, do you say lifetime ban, or do they have a 5-year ban before they can apply at your facility? And then the same thing with the sex offenders, because I know Ms. Crawford can probably attest to this. One of the things that I've seen in the court system a lot is there's a lot of people that are on that sex offender registry that the words or the legal semantics is the reason why they're there. So they may be banned or a licensed registered sex offender for 10 years, but once you find out the whole story, they really shouldn't have been on there in the first place. I mean, I think it all goes back into racism and housing, rental housing, but I just, when we say ban the box, you can't just do a blanket statement without having some clarity on what do you mean by banning the box. And I don't know if anybody else wants to weigh in on that.
Well, from my perspective, just let me say this. There's a federal mandate regarding those two categories that Ms. Polk mentioned, the methamphetamine manufacturing and also sex offender. Depending on the language, that can be a lifetime ban in federal housing. That presents a problem for returning citizens after they have served their time, after they have been rehabilitated, and maybe even after having gone through chemical dependency or whatever their substance abuse would have been. All of that has taken place, and now you have these additional compounding effects of race and the criminal history as it relates to housing discrimination. At some point, we have to have a fuller conversation for our returning citizens, even if they did manufacture meth, and say that was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. How long do we continue to ban those individuals from services that are desperately needed? A lot of times they come home with a bus ticket and a phone number of someone you must call when you settle. And that's your parole officer or your probation officer. And that's it. So you have no job, you have no place to stay, and you have no prospects of employment. So if you don't qualify for any type of federal funding or federal housing or federal subsidies, that presents other layers of problems in conjunction with race and criminal.
I know we're not going to be able to solve the
we will not. I'm sorry.
Criminal history.
I got on my soapbox. I'm sorry.
Right, we all have ours. But what I did want to do is point out that we did get some pretty good solutions and some resources out of this panel dialogue. From the Fair Housing, the Family Housing Advisory, the Tenants Rights Association, the importance of being able to attend the eviction court. I think that a lot of people don't really understand that just because you're being sued does not mean that you have been convicted of a crime or you have the judgment has been entered. So understanding the law and understanding your rights. And then I commend Danni and Pierce for highlighting that those target zip code areas have a lot of housing properties that are substandard to the code. So that's concerning. And last but not least, okay, housing standards. I was kind of disappointed, and I don't know how we do better, but I believe a landlord asked, she said that the Section 8 qualifications are difficult for them to keep up with. So it makes it hard for them to be able to be qualified to be subsidized housing providers. Do you guys think that's true, especially since there's only 20% Section 8 houses, and we know that we have tons of people that need that type of housing?
You know, I can't say with our apartment project, we worked with NIFA, we worked with MEG, we worked with Habitat for Humanities. We had a lot of conversations with a lot of people who have that knowledge. So I really, you know, I'm not the best person to talk about Section 8, but I think we need to have a conversation with OHA. I think they're the people that give out the vouchers. I'm not sure about that, but I think the best thing to do is to sit down with people and say, how does this work? You know, I had a lot of biases with our, within Dodge until I sat down with them and we, you know, reached an agreement on how this was all gonna work. And so I think that would be my first step, is let's figure out what is Section 8, what is general assistance? How are the two things different?
I had one, I don't know if Kevin Wyckoff, did you raise your hand by accident? I was gonna allow you to talk and then it went away, since we're getting towards the end. But, so raise your hand again if you decide you wanna talk. But then I think Mary Jane had a question. Donna, has some sort of appeal process for the drug manufacturing or sex offenders being turned down?
Do we have an appeal process? Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, I would have an appeal because I've been in the drug and alcohol or addiction business for over 30 years. So I have somewhat knowledge, even though meth is relatively new in communities of color. Okay, so I know the difference between a person who is manufacturing and a person who is using. And there is often a big distinction because you just don't end up smoking up or shooting up your whole product. So that's why I think even HUD made the distinction between users and manufacturers, because we have clients that have used, I've hired people that have used meth and heroin and other drugs. So I'm not anti-drug use, it's just specifically the manufacturing of meth, and it's something that this community better wake up to, because if heroin and fentanyl gets in here, we're in big trouble.
I just want to remind you guys that we will be putting a resource page together of some of the things that we've thrown out here for ideas. Another thing that I want to make sure I reiterate is the importance of understanding your rights as a tenant, understanding what housing discrimination looks like, and being able or questioning how to advocate for yourselves. I think one of the hardest things that our community doesn't understand is their rights, and they feel they don't have a voice. So if you are uncomfortable with what is going on, or you feel that something may have been violated, because sometimes it doesn't feel right, but you just don't quite know. You see some excellent resources here that you might be able to contact and say, hey, can you give me a chance? So you can look at our resource list that'll be on our Facebook page. I'm probably later next week, because this is busy time of the year, but where you can find information about rental properties, discrimination, and places to go to help advocate for yourself. The biggest part of being able to eliminate a problem is to come up with a solution. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that? No one? Whoa.
I will. Again, as it refers to returning citizens, I just want to say, Danny and who's our other researcher? I'm sorry.
Pierce,
yes. There's very scant research in this area where the intersection of race, criminal convictions, and how that plays out in particular communities. So I would advocate for more research in this area. Outside of litigation, there are some non-judicial types of reforms that can take place, and we talked about what some of those would look like. And I also think collectively we have to expand our resources, and there has to be a culture shift. And I think some of the work that Brea and some of the organizations that you have mentioned are helping make sure that that culture shift is taking place, but we all have a responsibility to be involved in it.
Okay, I think we have one question. Stephen Abrams, I'm going to allow you to talk.
Okay.
What is your
can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Yes, my name is Stephen Abraham. I'm one of the former commissioners for Omaha Housing Authority. And I just wanted to discuss a few things that I heard during the conversation. One of the things that when I was a commissioner for Omaha Housing Authority is the importance of addressing the returning citizens, as they, one of the issues is that they couch surf. So couch surfing is one of the big things that happens when it comes to recidivism. So my fellow commissioners and myself, we changed the criteria for nonviolent felony offenders to get housing. That was a huge thing. When I testified in front of the Judiciary Committee, I emphasized that will help empower those returning citizens to see value within themselves. Also property damage. When we talk about convictions in regards to evictions and, domestic abuse, you have individuals suffering from dual diagnosis of mental health and substance abuse. With my background in behavioral science and chemical dependency counseling, I thought that was very important as a commissioner to implement that into the criteria and the policies and procedures moving forward. Now, I know there was a couple other things that was mentioned, but I wanted to really touch back on the returning citizen part. Prior to us changing that criteria, it was 6 years after you were released from incarceration. The changes that we made is 2 years after conviction. So the wording, there was only one word that was changed. 2 years after conviction. So that individual can be convicted of a crime, go in and go and do their time, and when that 2-year mark hits, they can come and apply for housing. Now that is determined on the criteria if they meet the point system that was in place with Omaha Housing Authority. I feel that that will address a lot of important things that we're saying. Now that's relatively new. Of course, HUD has their own guidelines, and HUD allows individual public housing authorities to make changes to the point system in order to better serve our population, the community.
Thanks, Stephen. I think that information is awesome that you educated us on, but in essence of time, I think we have 7 minutes left, and I want to catch some other questions or see if the panelists had anything to kind of summarize what we've discussed this evening, besides the fact that we are going to do a resource list on our webpage.
I would like to say that we have a building directly across the street from our 44-unit apartment complex that will house supportive services, everything from residential treatment to outpatient. We're going to have a small clinic, a small cafe, a technology center that's in collaboration with Metro Community College, so that tenants and other people in the community can just go right across the street for those services. Because that's often a problem with people who are living, whether it's in rental property or their own property. A situation occurs, they don't know what to do. So we hope to be able to facilitate that discussion with them and whatever problem they're having by having those services accessible right across the street. So we envision that renovation will be completed by early 2022.
Thank you. Ms. Crawford, do you have anything you want to add?
I need to turn my mic on, don't I?
Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
I'd just like to say the gentleman who just spoke regarding the commissioners, I commend them for making that change so that it makes it easier for returning citizens to be able to have other options available to them. 2 years is a long time to wait when you have come home to basically nothing, but some change is better than no change at all. And I just would like to be able to maybe have some further collaborations with panelists so that we can all work towards some further solutions. Also through the Department of Black Studies, since we are multidisciplinary, we would love to be able to have conversations with other organizations as well in the community.
Thank you, Ms. Crawford. What about you, Bear?
Oh yeah, I do want to say that I think we as a community, we need to recognize predatory landlords and real estate agencies, and not only recognize and hold them accountable, but also implement serious consequences. We have to recognize that these aren't just ethical deviations, like these are direct attacks on law and direct attacks on the community. And so we need to create consequences like more forcible for revocation of their license or license suspension, financial penalties, stuff like that, where we really are holding predatory landlords accountable and real estate agencies accountable as well. And also, I do feel like there needs to be more diversity in the real estate agencies as a whole. We need to start we have to rely on or expect the real estate agencies to implement programs and mentorships for young real estate professionals of color to bring them more and to show more representation for diversity in the community, and also putting more real estate agencies into the Black and brown communities as well, instead of keeping them in suburban areas.
Thank you. Mr. Pierce, you have anything you would like to add?
Not much, just that I appreciate the opportunity to share, but then also to learn from you, and that it's heartening to see people that really care about this issue. And I think the one thing in terms of change is that I think there are some changes we can make within the system to make people that would immediately improve things for people like this legal representation and other things. But I also stand with Bear and others working on direct action against some of these systems, which can seem hard to change sometimes. So I'm sort of a yes and person, and I'm glad to see both of those approaches represented. And to anyone else interested in this issue, or is there's any way we could help through research or information on evictions from the past few years. And Danny and I have been collaborating on that as well. For more current stuff, feel free to reach out to me.
Danny, do you have anything to add?
I also learned a lot from the panel today, and it was really interesting to hear everyone's perspectives. So thank you for having this event and having us on. I would just like to remind anyone who isn't aware that there is still a CDC eviction moratorium in place. I will be sending a link in the chat to a tool that was built with collaboration from Moore. It was built by Code for Nebraska. And it can let you know if your eviction is likely to be legal or not. And as well, please just encouraging any folks in your network who might be at risk for eviction to make sure that they're educated about this moratorium, and to please contact Legal Aid or Creighton Legal Clinic, UNL for people in Lancaster County, just making sure we get people connected to those resources wherever we can.
So Danny, the moratorium isn't ending December 31st?
It is ending December 31st. So evictions.
Okay, we're running out of time here. On behalf of Moore, I thank all of you guys for attending our panel today. I look forward to sending you guys more invites for 2021. Again, you guys could follow us on Facebook. If you have any questions, we will have a resource list created from this panel this afternoon up on the webpage. Thank you guys. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.